Hello and welcome. I'm Charlie Peters and you're watching GB News YouTube. Now, I'm speaking to you on the back of 10 days of constant coverage of the national grooming gangs scandal. It sparked so many discussions, so many debates, and also plenty of news stories on this issue, an atrocity that has scarred so much of the country. Many of the people getting in touch with GB News have brought us news stories that we've shown on air. But beyond that most important part of this discussion, the survivors, their families, and the campaigners, there's also a lot of politics going on. There is a big debate in Westminster about whether or not we need a national grooming gangs inquiry. Now, the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, the head of the Tories, she's been demanding one since the 2nd of January, after GB News exclusively revealed that Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, had denied an independent government-led inquiry into the scandal in Oldham. That sparked that Tory opposition, backed up by Reform UK, calling for something beyond just Oldham, but that looks into the 50 different towns and cities across the country where GB News has found evidence of this sort of abuse. Now, what has the government said to that? Well, of course, they turned down that demand for an inquiry. They voted it down on Wednesday. 364 MPs, including also members of the Lib Dems, voting against it. Many Labour MPs and senior public figures have defended that move by sticking by the perspective that we don't need a proper inquiry because we already had the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Now, that concluded in 2022, and ever since the vote, indeed before the vote, we've had plenty of people refer to it as a grooming gangs inquiry. But we know, and everyone who looked into that inquiry knows, that IICSA, as it's referred to, refused to investigate Britain's most notorious sex grooming scandals and barred key witnesses from giving evidence. Now, the inquiry was given hundreds of millions of pounds, plenty of powers, it spoke to thousands of people over 7 years, but it totally neglected to look into the areas that already had significant reports on the abuse gangs. So let's go back to 2020, the key period for when IICSA looked into this issue, because it held 2 weeks of public hearings for a section in the report called Organised Networks. It was one of many strands. They looked at Jimmy Savile, they looked at the Church of England. In this section, they were meant to look at gangs. But grooming gangs were included in this bit. Now, we all anticipated at the time that this section would focus on the scandal, dive into revealing more appalling failures beyond what we'd already learned from Rotherham. By then, the crisis was well known. There'd already been successful prosecutions of predominantly Pakistani gangs in Rochdale, Rotherham, Oxford, Telford, Burnley, High Wycombe, Leicester, Dewsbury, Peterborough, Halifax and Newcastle upon Tyne. Many more towns would follow in the years after. GB News, as I said, we found at least 50 scarred by this scandal. The Tory MP for Keighley, Robbie Moore, last week, he told us it could be far more than 50. But where did IICSA look during that period of assessing the grooming gangs? They went to St Helens, Tower Hamlets, a portion of East London, Swansea in South Wales, Durham in the North East, and Bristol and Warwickshire in the West. None of these 6 areas had witnessed a major prosecution of these Pakistani abuse gangs. In fact, in all 6 of those areas, the proportion of the population that is of Pakistani origin is actually lower than the national average. Now, one witness to the inquiry, senior police officer from South Wales, said there was no data to demonstrate the presence of grooming gangs in Swansea. So IICSA decided to look into a town in Wales that literally had no data, rather than any of the many northern towns affected by this evil scourge. IICSA also elected to hear no evidence from survivors or experts who had recognised the pattern that had scarred so many towns. Now, if that information isn't damning enough about this so-called inquiry into the grooming gangs, then every single MP who voted against a proper one last week should watch back to the public hearings for what IICSA said on its opening day. Henrietta Hill, the QC and lead counsel to the inquiry, said that IICSA had carefully considered the extent to which, if at all, it should focus on areas such as Rochdale, Rotherham and Oxford, all of which had attracted public attention. End quote. She said that the inquiry had found it was instead, quote, more appropriate to focus instead on different areas not least because it was intended that this was a forward-looking investigation building on analysis that's already been done. End quote. Well, this deliberate decision not to look forward, but really to look away, was made in 2020. Many victims and campaigners arguing at the time said that there was a cowardly reluctance to confront the overrepresentation of Pakistanis in group-based abuse. CPS prosecutor Nazir Afzal said last week that we do not need an inquiry because there has already been an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, the catalyst for which was so-called grooming gangs. His words, not mine. He went on to say that it cost millions and the last government failed to accept much of its recommendations. But back in 2020, when this was going on, and when IICSA's approach to the grooming gangs were being set out, he slammed the inquiry's conduct as a nonsense. He also said that with the other strands of this inquiry, it's been about looking back at what went wrong to see we can learn from those mistakes. But this section, which is on the grooming gangs, he says, decided it was going to look forward, but you can't move forward without looking back at the failures. So my question to Nazir is, why have you changed your mind? Why are you now able to look forward and without looking back at these failures? Why are you now confident that the way to deal with the grooming gang scandal is to just accept the IICSA recommendations, an inquiry that you yourself said was a nonsense? Now, it's not just Nazir Afzal. Labour MP Sarah Champion, she also voted against an inquiry. She's the MP for Rotherham. She told The Observer on Sunday that I don't want an inquiry that will kick everything into the long grass. I want action. But what did she say in 2020 after the inquiry decided to exclude evidence of sex grooming networks in Northern England? Well, she said, you have to question what they are trying to achieve. It's more than a missed opportunity. So many survivors pinned their hopes on this inquiry getting to the truth. So, my question to Sarah is rather like my question to Nazir's. Why have you changed your mind?
Do you think this was a case of Miss Champion simply jumping before she was pushed into this?
I don't think she'd ever really be pushed. I think Labour possibly are quite keen for this story to go away. They're quite keen for the coverage of the grooming gangs issue to pass because it has caused such a headache for the Prime Minister. And really, in terms of Labour figures who've sparked this challenge, the first people to call for an inquiry were Blue Labour, that group within the party, typically seen as more conservative-leaning. Maurice Glasman, a Labour peer, he backed a national inquiry. He told GBNews exclusively he was doing so the day before the vote. But then we saw Andy Burnham after the vote on Thursday, the Manchester Mayor, calling for a limited inquiry. I now understand that what he means by limited is more a specific national inquiry, e.g. looking directly into the grooming gang scandal rather than a broader inquiry that we saw with IICSA. We've also seen Dan Carden, the Liverpool MP, breaking with Labour on Saturday. He was the only sitting MP to make a call at the time. He said to GBNews that he wanted a national inquiry or other state action to tackle this crisis. And this morning we've also heard from Paul Waugh, another Labour MP for Rochdale, saying that there was some case for a national inquiry. But I have to say, Martin, I think Miss Champion's intervention here is the most significant of the lot, not only because of the fact that she's got this 5-point plan, she's got all these other demands in there, but because of her standing within the party and the respect that she draws not just from other parliamentarians on this issue, but also campaigners, whistleblowers, survivors, and indeed their families.
Was last Wednesday's vote not also a missed opportunity to finally look at these nationwide failures? Now, it is my firm belief that we have never had a public inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. IICSA's so-called investigation into the gangs was a sham, and in the words of legendary Rochdale campaigner Maggie Oliver, a cover-up. Now, as I say, she is legendary. She came forward to me last night with a damning accusation that has sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Now, she claims that independent inquiry was nothing short of a cover-up because of the information that they included when she came forward with her testimony. Now, it's important before we look into this to understand the weight that her words carry. She's not just any critic, she's a woman who has dedicated her life to exposing the truth and fighting for justice for victims of child sexual abuse. Her decision to resign from Greater Manchester Police in 2012 was a pivotal moment in bringing the Rochdale grooming scandal to light. She was a fearless detective at the time, and she took an extremely bold step to help reveal the true extent of the scandal. And since then, she has been a tireless advocate for victims, often at great personal cost. Now, she told me that the inquiry was set up to investigate institutional failings, but they only heard from institutions. They didn't hear from the victims. Now, that's despite the inquiry's massive budget of £100 million. Only 2 victims were heard from directly. Maggie Oliver states that she had numerous victims who wanted to contribute to the inquiry, but their voices were seemingly silenced. This raises serious questions about the inquiry's commitment to putting victims and survivors at the heart of the investigation, as they claimed. And she has also revealed that the majority of her statement to the inquiry was redacted. I've seen both the 50-page statement prepared by her lawyers and the one that was in the report. It was just 18 pages. Now, the reason for this significant reduction remains unclear. IICSA, for their part at the time, said they included all of the relevant sections. But Maggie Oliver sees this as part of a pattern of silencing those who might disturb the apple cart. This redaction, like many other attempts to reduce the voices of campaigners and survivors, raises serious questions about the transparency of the inquiry process. What information was deemed irrelevant, too sensitive, or inappropriate for inclusion? Who made these decisions, and on what basis? These are questions that GB News is urgently seeking answers to. Now, since Maggie Oliver's resignation, she has established the Maggie Oliver Foundation, which has supported over 1,000 victims of abuse. This demonstrates her ongoing commitment to helping survivors of all kinds. And the allegations made by Maggie Oliver raise serious questions about the effectiveness and the integrity of that IICSA inquiry. These accusations don't just cast doubt on this particular inquiry, they potentially undermine public trust in all such investigations. This could have devastating consequences. The grooming gang scandal is one of the most shameful episodes in British history. The victims of these crimes deserve justice, and the public deserves to know the full truth about what happened and why it was allowed to continue for so long. If the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse has indeed failed in its duty, then urgent action is needed to address these shortcomings and ensure that future failures are not repeated. These are questions that the Labour Party need to answer. Why are they defending IICSA in face of all of this criticism? But these are also questions that the Conservative Party need to answer. IICSA was operating under their watch, and it was under that watch that the inquiry was so inept and frankly went astray. This is Charlie Peters for GB News, reminding you that the pursuit of truth and justice is never easy, but always necessary. We'll continue to follow this story and bring you exclusive updates as they develop. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more originals content.